Imagine this. You're mid-sentence, trying once again to explain yourself for what feels like the 100th time. Your heart pounds as you carefully craft each word, desperate for someone to finally get where you're coming from. You adjust your tone, choose your phrasing cautiously, maybe even soften your truth to make it easier for them to digest. You've become an expert at contorting yourself into clarity. But then, suddenly, something within you goes quiet. It's not an angry silence. It's not resentment or coldness. It's deeper. It's the kind of silence that feels eerily peaceful, like the eye of a storm. In that stillness, you realize something unmistakable. You're done. You're not going to keep explaining. And the truly unsettling part? It's not because you've given up on them. It's because you've finally stopped giving up on yourself. This is the terrifying moment when someone who's deeply empathic, someone who has spent years serving as the emotional translator in relationships, hits a psychological threshold. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology, explored this kind of inner transformation deeply. He didn't see it as a breakdown, but as a breakthrough, a moment of individuation, when a person stops abandoning themselves for the sake of being understood by others. Empaths, or people with heightened emotional sensitivity and awareness, often live in a constant state of tension. They're natural harmonizers, tuning into others' emotional frequencies before their own. Jung didn't use the modern term empath. It wasn't around in his time, but he deeply understood what we now call the empathic personality. In his landmark work, Psychological Types, published in 1921, and later writings like The Development of Personality, Jung identified a particular personality structure that aligned with this high sensitivity. He described what he called the feeling type, combined with introverted intuition, someone who interprets the world not through logic or external action, but through internal emotional resonance and deep symbolic pattern recognition. These people often intuit what others feel, even when nothing has been said. They notice subtle shifts in tone, expressions, body language, and energy. They don't just listen, they absorb. And this capacity, while remarkable, comes with a cost. Think about your own life for a moment. How many times have you felt the weight of someone else's emotions before they even acknowledged them themselves? How often have you altered your behavior, adjusted your needs, or even rewritten your truth to maintain emotional balance around you? You might not even notice you're doing it. It becomes second nature, a reflex. But behind this reflex lies a profound psychological toll, a slow erosion of boundaries, and a growing distance from your own sense of self. Jung saw this clearly. He understood that those with permeable emotional boundaries often carry not just their own psychological content, but the unprocessed emotions and unconscious material of others as well. He borrowed a term from anthropology, participation mystique, to describe this phenomenon. A state in which individuals psychologically merge with others to the point where they lose a clear sense of where they end and others begin. When you live this way for long enough, always tuning in, always adjusting, always explaining, it creates a dangerous imbalance. You start to carry the emotional weight of others without reciprocity. You become a container for everyone else's shadows. And over time, something in you starts to fracture. You begin to feel numb or drained or invisible. You might find yourself saying, "I just can't do this anymore," and not fully understanding why. But Jung did. He called this breaking point enantiodromia, the sudden emergence of the opposite. In other words, when a pattern or behavior is taken to its extreme, the psyche eventually swings to the other side in an effort to restore balance. For empaths, this means the years of constant giving, accommodating, and explaining can abruptly shift into silence, withdrawal, detachment. Not because they've stopped caring, but because their psyche refuses to let them keep bleeding. Jung didn't see this shift as a breakdown in empathy. Quite the opposite. He considered it a necessary evolution, a transformation from unconscious empathy to conscious relationship. This is an important distinction. Most empathic people engage with others through what Jung would have called identification or projection. In identification, you lose yourself in another person's emotional state. You feel their sadness, confusion, or fear as if it were your own. In projection, you assume others process emotions the way you do, that they'll understand your depth, your nuance, your sensitivity. Neither of these forms are sustainable. They can lead to burnout, boundary collapse, and the very thing Jung warned against, psychic infection. That's when your psychological boundaries are so thin that you begin to carry other people's unconscious burdens. Over time, you no longer know which feelings are yours and which belong to someone else. Your sense of self dissolves in the name of connection, but it's not real connection. It's enmeshment. This is where Jung's silent protocol begins. It's not a checklist or a behavioral hack. It's a shift in being, a reorientation toward the self. It starts when you feel the pull to explain, to clarify, to justify, to soften. And instead, you stop. You let the discomfort of misunderstanding sit in the room without rushing to resolve it. You say things like, "I see we're not on the same page," and then you stop talking. No extra labor, no emotional backflips, no chasing validation. At first, this feels deeply wrong, especially if you've spent your life as the peacekeeper, the fixer, the one who always bridges emotional gaps. You'll feel guilty. You'll worry that you're being cold or cruel, that you're failing in your role as the understanding one. But Jung would argue that this moment of silence is not a rejection of empathy. It's the beginning of authentic empathy. Because true empathy, according to Jung, must begin with the self. He wrote extensively about the concept of proper distance in human relationships. Without that distance, he argued, what you have isn't relationship, it's fusion. He used the image of two porcupines huddling together in the winter. They need each other for warmth, but if they get too close, they wound each other with their quills. The key is finding the distance where connection is possible without pain. For the empath who over-explains, that distance has collapsed. The other person's comfort has become more important than their own clarity. The silent protocol restores that space. But silence is not neutral. It disrupts dynamics, especially in relationships where the empath has been doing all the work of understanding and translating. When you stop explaining, it creates a vacuum, and for many this is unsettling. Those who have relied on your emotional labor may react with confusion, anger, or manipulation. They may say things like, "You've changed," or "You're being distant," or "You're not yourself." And in a way, they're right. You're no longer the self they depended on, the self that always made things easier for them. You're becoming the self who makes things real. This is where many empathic people falter. The guilt becomes too much. The pressure to return to old patterns too strong. But Jung insisted that the person who is individuating, who is becoming their whole authentic self, will inevitably disrupt the status quo. Not because they seek conflict, but because their very presence demands consciousness. They stop playing the role. They stop performing safety. And that shift challenges everyone around them to either grow or retreat. Jung wrote, "The individuated person becomes an irritant to those who remain unconscious. This is the cost of psychological freedom. And for empaths, it's a heavy price, because so much of their self-worth has been tied to being likable, relatable, easy to be around. But the truth is, being deeply understood by a few is far more nourishing than being superficially accepted by many." At the core of this transformation is a radical idea that empathy without boundaries is not empathy. It's erasure. Jung saw this clearly in his patients. Many came to him not because they lacked empathy, but because they had too much of it, unguarded and unchecked. They were exhausted, not from conflict, but from constantly molding themselves into digestible shapes for others. Their relationships weren't mutual exchanges of understanding. They were one-sided performances, emotional labor that left them depleted and resentful. One such example Jung wrote about in Modern Man in Search of a Soul involved a woman in her 40s who had spent her adult life mediating family conflicts, soothing friends, and managing the emotional climates of every room she entered. She wasn't visibly broken. She wasn't screaming or sobbing. Instead, she spoke of a kind of emotional numbness. "I used to care so much about being understood," she told Jung, "but now I just don't." There was no rage, no resentment, only a quiet withdrawal. She was tired, not from lack of love, but from overextension. Jung didn't see this as depression in the traditional sense. He recognized it as a psychic turning point, the moment when the unconscious, after being ignored for too long, reclaims space. He called it differentiation, the beginning of separating your authentic self from the roles you've played for others. This woman was not breaking down. She was waking up. And that's what makes this moment so terrifying. When you've lived your life as the explainer, the comforter, the emotional interpreter, silence feels like betrayal, not just to others, but to the identity you've built. You might wonder, am I becoming heartless? Or am I just like the people who hurt me? But Jung would urge you to reframe this. He'd tell you that this isn't the death of your empathy. It's the birth of your psychological integrity. He once wrote, "The person who has not yet found themselves cannot make a real relationship with others." In other words, you can't truly connect if you've made yourself a ghost in the process, if you've erased your needs, your truth, your complexity just to keep others comfortable. True connection requires two selves, not a self and a performer, not a person and a peacekeeper. So, what does Jung's silent protocol actually look like in real life? It begins with withdrawing projective empathy, that unconscious habit of assuming others feel as you do, or that it's your job to make them comfortable with your truth. Instead, you begin practicing what Jung called conscious relation. This is empathy from a grounded center. You stay connected to your own experience even as you acknowledge someone else's. You don't collapse into them, nor do you demand that they collapse into you. You create a space where difference is allowed, where understanding is mutual, not coerced. Let's say you're in a conversation and someone misinterprets your intentions. In the past, you might have gone into overdrive, explaining, softening, rephrasing, until they felt okay again. But under the silent protocol, you pause. You might say, "It seems we see this differently," and then leave it there. You resist the urge to make them okay with your point of view. You allow the misunderstanding to exist, not because you don't care, but because you've learned that caring doesn't mean self-sacrifice. This is the moment where the silence becomes a boundary, a form of care for yourself and for the relationship, because real connection requires space. And when you over-explain, you eliminate that space. You crowd the emotional landscape with your efforts to be understood, leaving no room for the other person to meet you halfway. Jung believed that proper psychological distance is essential. Without it, there's no I and you, only a blur of codependence. But what happens to the people around you when you begin to live this new way? When someone who has always over-explained suddenly stops, it causes a shift, a kind of psychological void. The people who have grown accustomed to your constant emotional labor now find themselves in unfamiliar territory. They've relied on your explanations not just to understand you, but to avoid doing the hard work of understanding themselves. This is why silence for an empath can feel almost violent. Not because it is, but because of how it's perceived. Others may feel abandoned or exposed. They may accuse you of being distant or different. And they're not wrong. You have changed. But the change isn't about coldness, it's about alignment. You're no longer bending yourself to be digestible. You're finally becoming congruent with your truth. Jung saw this dynamic play out constantly in his practice. In The Development of Personality, he wrote that when one person becomes more conscious, more individuated, it disrupts the relationships built on unconscious agreements. These are the relationships where one person carries all the self-awareness, all the communication, all the emotional translation. When you withdraw from that role, the imbalance becomes starkly visible. But this is exactly what must happen for true relationship to emerge. Jung believed that genuine intimacy could only occur between two people committed to their own psychological development. Anything else, he argued, was just mutual projection, two people engaging with illusions rather than reality. When you stop over-explaining, you invite others to meet you in the space of real mutuality. It's an uncomfortable invitation because it requires them to step up, to ask instead of assume, to listen instead of react, to process instead of deflect. Not everyone will accept that invitation. Some relationships will fall away, not because you're rejecting them, but because you're refusing to maintain a dynamic that keeps you small. This is the silent protocol's most painful truth. Not every relationship survives your growth, and that's okay. Jung would say that the relationships that crumble under the weight of your authenticity were never built to hold it in the first place. They were built on your performance, not your presence. But, and this is critical, the relationships that do survive become deeper, richer, more honest. These are the people who don't need you to explain every detail of your emotional landscape in order to respect it. They're capable of sitting with complexity, of asking thoughtful questions, of being curious instead of defensive. These people value your truth, even when it challenges their comfort. Jung referred to this kind of relationship as one based on mutual individuation. It's not about agreement, it's about respect. Each person maintains their own center while staying connected. There's space for difference, for confusion, even for conflict, but none of it threatens the bond, because the bond isn't based on control or validation. It's based on shared commitment to self-awareness. This is the heart of Jung's silent protocol. It's not about retreating from relationship. It's about transforming the kind of relationships you allow. It's a declaration. I will no longer contort myself to be seen. I will be as I am and trust that those capable of real connection will rise to meet me. And here's something many people forget. Silence is not absence. It's presence of a different kind, a deeper kind. It says, I trust myself enough to not over-explain, and I trust you enough to either meet me in this space or not. Of course, embracing this kind of silence comes with fear, real, bone-deep fear. The fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being rejected, the fear that once you stop explaining, no one will care enough to try understanding. And those fears aren't irrational. They're echoes of past experiences, of relationships where your value was tied to how much emotional labor you provided, how easy you made it for others to connect with you. Jung never minimized this fear. In fact, he faced it himself. After his break with Freud, a rupture that left him professionally isolated and personally shaken, he entered what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. It was a period marked by solitude, uncertainty, and what some would describe as madness. He lost connections, questioned his own thinking, and spent years wrestling with the complexity of his inner world.
But Jung also said that this descent was necessary. Only by letting go of the need to be constantly understood by Freud, by peers, by the academic establishment, could he access the depth of insight that would become the foundation of analytical psychology. He realized something profound. Your truth doesn't require universal validation. It doesn't need to be translated into a language everyone else speaks. Your authenticity is its own authority. This is the core of the silent protocol. You stop managing people's responses to you. You stop translating your experience into something more palatable. And in doing so, you learn to tolerate the tension of being misunderstood, not because misunderstanding is pleasant, but because the alternative is self-erasure. Let's make this concrete. Say you've just expressed a difficult truth in a relationship, maybe something about your needs, your limits, or a hurt you've been carrying. The other person reacts defensively. They interrupt, deny, or twist your words. In the past, you might have jumped in to rephrase, to soothe, to make it easier for them to hear. That was the old script. The script that kept you safe by keeping others comfortable. Under the silent protocol, the script changes. You say what's true, once, clearly, and then you stop. If they react, you let them. If they accuse you of being vague or confusing, you don't spiral into self-doubt. You remember, your clarity isn't dependent on their comprehension. And if they value the relationship, they'll do the work to understand. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. If they don't, that's information, not failure. This is the scary part, letting go of control. Because explaining can be a form of control, a way to manage the emotional climate of the room. When you stop doing that, things can feel unpredictable. People might pull away. Some might lash out. But Jung would urge you to stay the course, to trust that authenticity invites alignment, that the people who resonate with your real self will find you, but only if you stop hiding behind translation. And what you gain in this process is priceless. Self-trust. Not the kind that comes from being liked or approved of, but the kind that's rooted in knowing your own voice, your own values, your own worth, independent of external response. Jung called this individuated consciousness, the state in which a person becomes whole, not by eliminating contradiction, but by integrating it. You become someone who can be both open and boundaried, empathic and self-protective, connected and sovereign. That's the gift of the silence. Not isolation, but integrity. Jung emphasized that individuation, the process of becoming your true self,
is not a solitary withdrawal from the world. Rather, it is the foundation upon which real relationship is built. Without individuation, you're not relating, you're enacting. You're playing roles, the fixer, the nurturer,
The peacemaker, hoping these performances earn you the connection you crave. But true connection doesn't come from performance. It comes from presence. And presence requires boundaries. Boundaries in this context aren't walls. They're not about shutting others out or retreating into cold detachment. They're the lines that define where you end and another begins, the necessary space in which authentic encounter can occur. For empaths, this is difficult terrain. The natural impulse is to merge, to dissolve into the emotional atmosphere of others. But Jung warned that without boundaries, empathy becomes enmeshment, and love becomes sacrifice. He made a distinction between primary empathy, the automatic unconscious absorption of others' emotions, and developed empathy, which is grounded in self-awareness. Developed empathy is deliberate. It comes from a place of strength. It doesn't abandon itself in order to understand another. Instead, it says, "I can see you, but I will not lose me in the process." This is a powerful shift, and it changes everything, especially how you communicate. Under the silent protocol, you begin to speak from wholeness rather than from need. You stop trying to prove your worth or your perspective. You start honoring your experience as valid, even when others don't mirror it back. Imagine you're in a situation where you've been vulnerable. Maybe you shared something painful or important. The other person responds with dismissal or defensiveness. In the past, you might have doubled down, trying harder to explain, to make them see your side. But now, you do something different. You let their reaction be theirs. You don't try to change it. You say your piece, and then you stand still in the silence that follows. This silence is not passive aggression. It's not emotional withdrawal. It's the sound of emotional maturity. You're no longer trying to curate someone else's reaction to you. You're allowing them to meet you as they are, and yourself as you are. It's uncomfortable, yes. But Jung believed this discomfort was essential. He wrote that most people spend their lives trying to avoid the discomfort of true psychological development. They avoid it by conforming, by shrinking, by people-pleasing. But individuation demands that we face that discomfort head-on, that we let go of being universally understood in favor of being authentically known. He even wrote, "The person who finds their own path must walk it alone, but that aloneness is not loneliness. It is wholeness." That's a profound reframe. What you might feel in the silence, the absence of validation, the lack of instant understanding, isn't loneliness. It's the space where your real self can finally emerge. And once it does, it becomes magnetic. Not to everyone, but to the right ones. Because when you stop over-explaining, you stop attracting relationships built on dependence. You stop inviting people who need you to carry the weight of emotional understanding alone. Instead, you begin to attract and to recognize those who are also doing their inner work. People who don't need you to simplify yourself for their comfort. People who ask, "Can you help me understand?" Instead of saying, "You're too much," or "You're too sensitive." These are the relationships worth nurturing. Not because they're perfect or easy, but because they are reciprocal. They are rooted in mutual self-respect. And that, Jung believed, is the soil where real transformation grows, for both people involved. Now, let's address the shadow side of this transformation, because every growth process has one. Jung believed that if you want to integrate your full self, you have to confront not just your light, but your darkness. not just your love and understanding, but also your anger, your grief, your unmet needs. When an empath stops explaining, all those repressed parts start surfacing, and it can feel overwhelming. You may start to feel anger you thought you were above. You might remember moments, small and large, where you bent yourself into knots to maintain peace, and realized just how often your needs were dismissed or minimized. The instinct may be to push those feelings down, to go back to explaining as a way to avoid the rawness of this emotional reckoning. But Jung would caution against that. He'd remind you that these feelings are not signs of regression, they are signs of emergence. Your real self is coming online, the self that doesn't exist to please, but to live. This stage Jung called the confrontation with the shadow, and it's as necessary as it is painful. You have to acknowledge the parts of yourself that have been silenced, the resentment, the fatigue, the desire to be held instead of always doing the holding. These parts are not shameful, they are essential. They contain the energy you need to sustain your new way of being. And if you ignore them, if you try to skip this stage, you risk falling into what Jung warned against, the wounded healer complex. This archetype describes the person who becomes adept at healing others because they themselves are wounded, but who never turns their healing inward. Empaths often fall into this role. They soothe, they support, they give endlessly. But until they learn to direct that same compassion inward, they remain stuck. Helpful, yes, but also hollow. The silent protocol is, in many ways, the wounded healer turning inward. It's saying, I will not abandon myself for connection. I will not trade authenticity for approval. I will not explain myself into invisibility. And this shift requires you to develop a tolerance for discomfort, your own and others. That means letting others sit with their confusion, their upset, their disapproval, without rushing to fix it. And it means sitting with your own fear that, without explanation, you'll be left alone. But here's where Jung's insight offers hope. He believed that once you move through the shadow, once you integrate those difficult emotions, you reach a state of deeper wholeness. You no longer have to pretend to be only your light. You become real, and from that realness, your relationships evolve. Now, instead of giving out of compulsion, you give by choice. Instead of softening your words to avoid conflict, you speak with clarity and trust that the right people will lean in. Instead of constantly managing how others experience you, you allow space for complexity, both yours and theirs. This is emotional sovereignty. And it's not cold or disconnected. In fact, it's the opposite. It's intimacy that isn't built on self-betrayal. It's empathy that includes you too. One of the most liberating outcomes of embracing the silent protocol is the ability to reclaim your narrative, not by convincing others of it, but by fully owning it yourself. Jung emphasized that the ultimate goal of individuation wasn't perfection, but integration. That is, accepting all parts of yourself, even the messy, misunderstood, or inconvenient ones, as vital components of your whole. When you stop over-explaining, you reclaim authority over your own story. You stop handing out interpretive guides to your existence. Instead, you allow people to encounter you as you are, not as the edited version designed to avoid discomfort. And that shift does something powerful. It reveals who is truly capable of walking beside you in your full truth. Many people, perhaps even those closest to you, won't know what to do with this new version of you. They'll miss the version who smoothed things over,
who gave them endless access to your emotional bandwidth. They may feel unsettled, even threatened, not because you're doing something wrong, but because your transformation shines a light on what they've refused to examine in themselves. This isn't about superiority or blame. It's about clarity. The more you step into your authenticity, the more visible the emotional imbalance in your relationships becomes. Jung believed this clarity was essential, not just for your own well-being, but for the health of your connections. In his view, relationships should be places where both people grow, not where one grows while the other remains stagnant. That's why the silent protocol is so disruptive and so valuable. It disrupts the unspoken contracts that have kept relationships comfortable but unbalanced. Contracts like, "I'll keep making myself smaller if you promise to never question me," or "I'll keep explaining myself if you promise to never really challenge yourself." These contracts are often unconscious, but they govern so many interactions, especially for empaths. And when you stop signing those contracts, people notice. Some may resist, some may leave, but others, the ones who are also committed to growth, will stay. They'll rise. They'll meet you not as someone to be managed or interpreted, but as an equal.
Jung believed that this was the foundation of true intimacy, mutual individuation. Each person doing their own psychological work, not to perfect themselves, but to show up whole. That kind of relationship can handle silence. It can handle complexity. It can handle not having all the answers right away. When you enact the silent protocol, you're not withdrawing love. You're refining how you give it, and to whom. You're moving from a mode of performance to a mode of presence. You're no longer trying to be understood by everyone. You're creating space to be truly known by the few who matter most. And in that space, something unexpected happens. Peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the solid peace that comes from standing in your truth. No longer translating yourself to be digestible. No longer negotiating your worth through others' comprehension. You begin to live in your own language, and those meant to understand you will learn it. Jung often wrote that transformation begins not with the external world, but within the psyche. And one of his most striking ideas was the concept of conscious suffering. He believed that much of the suffering we endure is unconscious. We absorb pain, suppress it, carry it in silence, but never fully face it. The empath who constantly explains is in many ways suffering unconsciously. They feel the emotional toll of being misunderstood, of having to justify their feelings, but instead of confronting that pain, they try to manage it by being more accommodating, more articulate, more agreeable. The silent protocol reverses this dynamic. It says, feel the discomfort consciously. Let the pain of being misunderstood rise to the surface. Let the ache of not being received fully break through the performative calm. And then stay with it. Don't run, don't rescue, don't explain. Just witness it. This is the crucible of psychological change. Jung saw it as alchemy, a process of inner transformation as profound as turning lead into gold. He believed that we go through stages. Nigredo, the blackening, where the old self dissolves. Albedo, the whitening, where clarity begins to emerge. And rubedo, the reddening, where integration is achieved and the new self is born. The silent protocol for many empaths is the start of nigredo, the uncomfortable but necessary death of the persona they've used to survive. And yes, it can feel like death. The death of your role in certain relationships. The death of your belief that you must always be the one to smooth things over.
the death of your unconscious agreement to sacrifice yourself for connection. But it's also the birth of something more honest, a relationship with yourself that isn't contingent on being pleasing, a capacity for intimacy that includes boundaries, a trust in your worth that isn't based on how easily others can digest your truth. You become someone who doesn't need to be universally understood because you've finally understood yourself. And this understanding isn't conceptual, it's embodied. You feel it in your nervous system, in the moments where someone misreads you and you don't flinch, in the moments where someone challenges your experience and you don't spiral into self-doubt, in the moments where you feel alone but not lost. That's what Jung meant by wholeness, not perfection, not endless harmony, but the ability to hold opposites, connection and separation, empathy and boundary, love and discernment, without collapsing into explanation. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this journey? Once you've moved through the fire of your own transformation, you become the kind of person who can hold space for others to do the same. Not by overfunctioning, not by over-explaining, but by modeling what it looks like to stay true to yourself in the face of pressure to conform. You show through your presence, not your performance, that it's possible to be both deeply empathic and radically self-honoring. This is the essence of Jung's legacy for empaths and emotionally attuned individuals. Not to stop caring, but to care in a way that includes yourself. To recognize that the endless need to explain, to justify, to make yourself understood isn't a sign of emotional depth. It's a sign that your empathy has been weaponized against your own well-being. When you stop explaining, you begin the sacred process of living in your truth without apology. You stop watering yourself down for others' comfort. You start speaking in your full voice and trusting that those meant to hear it will listen. Jung would call this the conjunctio, the sacred union of opposites within the self. It is the psychological state where you no longer reject any part of who you are, your sensitivity and your strength, your compassion and your clarity, your desire to connect and your need to protect. And yes, it's terrifying. To stop explaining is to step off the stage of emotional performance, to risk being misread, to risk being alone. But it is also an initiation into a life that is truly yours. You'll lose some relationships, but what remains, what survives the silence, is gold. Real connection, grounded intimacy, relationships where your presence is valued more than your performance. And, perhaps most importantly, you gain a relationship with yourself that is no longer conditional. You become the one who no longer needs to be seen a certain way to feel worthy. You become the one who doesn't need to be easy to understand to deserve love. You become, finally, free. So, if you're in this moment, if the silence has already begun to settle, trust it. Let it guide you. Let it show you what you've been afraid to face, that you are not here to explain yourself into existence. You are here to exist, fully, freely, unapologetically. And the right people, the ones who know how to listen, not just with their ears, but with their hearts, will meet you there. If this message speaks to your journey, share your story in the comments. Let others know they're not alone in this transformation. And if this video helped illuminate your path, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the most powerful act of empathy is not explaining more. It's embodying your truth and trusting that it's enough.